Hey guys, hope you're doing good. Just trucking right along this week. We finished chapter 11 yesterday. Or I'm sorry, we finished chapter 12 yesterday. So make sure that you have taken the chapter 12 quiz. And now we're going to start on chapter 13. We just finished chapter 12 with the spinal cord and spinal nerves. Now we're going to be looking at the brain and the cranial nerves. The brain is kind of complicated because there's lots of little parts, and it seems like there's lots of little parts that kind of seem to almost do the same thing. And so it can be a little bit confusing. Luckily, you're doing this on online, so therefore, hopefully it won't be quite as bad for you. Again, our brain has our brain and spinal cord have the greatest concentration of nervous tissue in our body. Our brain specifically has about 100 billion neurons and a trillion glial cells just in the brain. And each neuron of those 100 billion has about 10,000 connections. So, you could calculate how many connections there are. And this is where everything that you know, everything that you are, it all is there stored in these neurons, in the connections, and in the connections between these neurons. You've probably heard before that we only use about 10% of our brain. There was actually a movie, and I forget the name of it now, where this girl was able to unlock more of her brain, and she ended up turning into pure energy and going into the wires at the end or something. I forget the name of it. You guys probably know it though. But anyway, again, that is total fiction. That we only use 10% of our brain is not true. So there's no way that she could open up more of the brain that she wasn't using to make her so much smarter and eventually able to turn into pure energy. No. We use nearly every part of our brain. We may not be using every single part of the brain every single minute, but we use all parts of our brain. So it's not like you only use 10% of your brain. You use your whole brain. There are 4 major divisions of our brain: the brainstem, cerebellum, cerebrum, and the diencephalon. And we will be looking at each one of those in more detail today. Specifically, we're going to look at the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the diencephalon. And then we'll be looking at the cerebrum next Monday. Again, here is a picture showing the different parts of the brain. And sorry, guys, I'm getting messages on Google Hangouts from Miss Crow, I think. So that's why it keeps beeping. Anyway, so here we can see the largest part is the cerebrum. This is humans have the most highly developed cerebrum of any other animal in the animal kingdom, and it is what separates us from all the other animals in the animal kingdom. It gives us the abilities that other animals don't have, like speech and understanding speech and problem solving and planning and things like that. Then we have our diencephalon here, kind of in the very center of our brain. We have our brainstem, which is made up of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. We'll talk about those more in a minute. And then we have the cerebellum here, kind of on the posterior side of our brain. So the cerebrum makes up the anterior portion as well as the superior portion of our brain. Also part of the posterior portion. The cerebellum is also there in the posterior area. Again, the diencephalon is really central, and then the brainstem is going to be inferior for sure. And you can see that it is continuous with the spinal cord. The spinal cord would be connecting right down here. How does our brain and spinal cord develop in the embryonic stages? Well, you have in the ectoderm of the embryo, remember those 3 germ layers, the endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. The ectoderm, remember, gives rise to our skin and body coverings like hair, as well as our nervous system. Specifically in the ectoderm, you have a flat plate of tissue called the neural plate. It's on the dorsal surface of the embryo. The lateral sides will end up kind of folding up and forming neural folds, and the crest of each one of those, it's kind of like the crest of a wave. The crest of the fold is called the neural crest, and as those folds just keep folding up and moving inward, they form what we call the neural tube. The head or the cephalic portion of the tube becomes the brain, and the caudal or tail end of that tube becomes the spinal cord. So this is a picture showing you this neural tube. You can see how it begins. Here's the neural plate. It begins folding, and it kind of looks like a wave here. Okay, so these folds are called the neural folds. The crest or the top of those folds is called the neural crest, and as those folds just continue to move inward, we end up forming this neural tube, which becomes the brain and spinal cord. Again, the cephalic end or head end becomes the brain, and the caudal or tail end becomes the spinal cord of that tube. Okay, so within that neural tube, you are going to form pouches, and there will be 3 regions of the brain that will form from these pouches. The forebrain will give rise to the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Again, fore, kind of thinking like front or before. So the pouch on the fore end of that cephalic region becomes the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Then another pouch becomes the midbrain, and then the hindbrain, or the more toward the posterior side of that cephalic region, becomes the pons and cerebellum, as well as the medulla oblongata. Now, and they go into the telencephalon, metencephalon, myencephalon. I'm not going to worry about that. Again, we do need to know the diencephalon, the cerebrum, the midbrain, the pons, the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata. I'm not going to ask you about the metencephalon, telencephalon, or myencephalon. Cavities within the pouches, within these pouches, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, become ventricles. Again, these ventricles are continuous with one another, as well as continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. And remember, cerebrospinal fluid circulates through these ventricles and the central canal, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So again, we can see here, here's your neural tube. Here is the forebrain, going to give rise to that cerebrum and the diencephalon. Here's the midbrain, and then here's the hindbrain, going to give rise to the medulla oblongata, and the pons and some of those things. And again, the colors kind of show you, here, this part, here's the pink becoming the cerebrum here, the green becoming the diencephalon, the purple here becoming the midbrain, and then the blue and the green here, the blue becoming the cerebellum, and this bluish green becoming the medulla oblongata. Okay, so we're going to start with the brainstem first. Again, the brainstem is continuous with the spinal cord, so the spinal cord connects to the brain there at the medulla oblongata. There are 3 major regions of the brainstem: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. You have a reticular formation that spans all 3 of these regions. We'll talk about it here in just a few minutes. It basically just consists of many nuclei. Nuclei are clusters of neurons in our central nervous system. So when we talk about nuclei, that's what we're talking about, just clusters of neurons in our central nervous system. Again, collectively, our brainstem is responsible for many of our autonomic life-sustaining functions. So damage to our brainstem a lot of times will cause death, because the brainstem, all of these portions are going to be responsible for things that our life depend, that we depend on to live. So looking first at the most inferior portion of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, again, is continuous with the spinal cord. Again, like our spinal nerves are mixed nerves, our medulla oblongata could also be considered mixed because it contains both ascending and descending tracts. In other words, it contains both sensory and motor nerve tracts. Again, it's going to have, in the gray matter on the inside, it's going to have nuclei, which are clusters of neurons in the central nervous system. Again, the medulla oblongata is going to be responsible for some of those very important autonomic life-sustaining functions. It helps to regulate our heart rate, the constriction and dilation of our blood vessels, breathing, also some of those reflexes, including swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, coughing, and sneezing. So these would be considered reflexes that are the center for those are in our medulla oblongata. A couple of structures present on our medulla oblongata are the pyramids and the olives. The pyramids are on the anterior side of the medulla oblongata. And they are going to contain motor nerve tracts that control our skeletal muscles. And we have some decussation, or on the inferior side of these pyramids, you have the nerve fibers are decussating, and decussate means to cross to the opposite side. So basically, nerve fibers kind of cross over to the other side. They decussate. And this is where you've probably heard that one side of your brain controls the opposite side of your body. Well, this is kind of where that's coming from. The nerve fibers in these pyramids are crossing over to the other side so that each half of your brain is controlling the opposite side of the body. So this decussation allows that to occur, and this is happening there in the pyramids. The other portion of the medulla oblongata we want to be familiar with are the olives. They are on the lateral surface of the medulla oblongata, and they are going to help regulate balance, coordination, and again, associated with sound from your inner ear. So not only are we receiving sound from our inner ear, but we also have our inner ear also helps to give us a sense of balance. And the olives of our medulla oblongata are helping to regulate the information coming in from that inner ear as far as balance and coordination and sound. Also, nuclei from cranial nerves 5, 7, and 9 through 12 are found in the olives of the medulla oblongata. So if we go ahead and look at the medulla oblongata really quick, right here, we can see the olives here protruding out laterally, and we can see the pyramids here anterior, on the anterior surface. Again, looking at the lateral surface, we can see those olives very well here on the lateral side. You're not really seeing the pyramids very well here because like these some of these cranial nerves here are kind of blocking your view of those. You're able to see more of the back or posterior side here, and then you can see those olives very clearly on the lateral side. Okay, so another part of the brainstem is the pons. Again, it is going to be just superior, so the medulla oblongata is the most inferior portion of the brainstem. The pons is just a little bit superior to that. Again, like the medulla oblongata, it does contain sensory and motor nerve tracts, and it has some nuclei. Again, pontine is referring to the pons. So pontine nuclei are going to actually relay information between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So again, we're looking at the brainstem here. Kind of posterior to the brainstem, superior and posterior, we have the cerebellum. Way superior, we have the cerebrum. So the brainstem is kind of providing a connection between, specifically the pons of the brainstem, is providing a connection between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So it's helping to send information between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and the pontine nuclei in the pons are doing that. There's also nuclei for cranial nerves 5 through 8. In the pons on the posterior side. We also have in the pons the pontine sleep center, which helps to initiate REM sleep. Remember, that's rapid eye movement. This is actually when the restorative function of sleep happens. During REM sleep, cells are able to repair themselves and your body is able to restore itself. Without REM sleep, you would die. And then also in the pons, in addition to the sleep center, we have a respiratory center. It helps the medulla oblongata to coordinate respiratory movements, so you know the movements that are involved in breathing. And so here we can see our pons. Again, we're not really seeing those pontine nuclei, the pontine sleep center, or the pontine respiratory center, because those aren't necessarily really structures. Those, again, are nuclei. They are clusters of neurons within that pons that you really probably are not going to see. So again, medulla oblongata here, the most inferior portion. Then we have our pons, which is just superior to that. And then superior to the pons, we're going to have the midbrain, which we're going to talk about next. And again, this is just kind of showing you like where some of these cranial nerves, where the nuclei for these cranial nerves are located, as far as in the medulla oblongata as well as up here in the pons, and we're going to have some here in the midbrain as well. So again, the midbrain, don't worry about that name mesencephalon. I'm going to call it the midbrain. Again, it is very small and it is just superior to the pons. It also has the nuclei for some cranial nerves, specifically cranial nerves 3 through 5. It also contains a tectum and a tegmentum, as well as cerebral peduncles, and we'll talk about those in a minute. First, let's talk about the tectum. The tectum consists of 4 nuclei, which are mounds on the dorsal surface of the midbrain, and these 4 nuclei collectively are called the corpora quadrimina. Each of these 4 nuclei, each of these 4 mounds are called each one is called a colliculus. Plural is colliculi. So you have 2 superior and 2 inferior colliculi. The 2 superior colliculi are involved with visual, auditory, and tactile or touch sensory, as well as moving your head and eyes and body toward those sensory stimuli. And then our two inferior colliculi are involved in hearing. So collectively, we could say the tectum or the corpora quadrimina are involved in receiving sensory stimuli, receiving sensory information from our eyes, our ears, our skin, and our as well as some motor function in terms of allowing our head, eyes, and body to move toward those stimuli. So, for example, when you hear a loud noise, you turn your head and your eyes toward that noise to look to see what it was. So that is kind of controlled by those two superior colliculi. Okay, in our midbrain, we also have red nuclei and substantia nigra. The red nuclei are involved in the unconscious regulation and coordination of motor activity. So again, unconsciously regulating and coordinating your movements, your skeletal muscle contraction and movements. And then the substantia nigra, you can probably hear my dog howling and whining. She does that all the time. It's annoying. Just ignore her. The substantia nigra, again, nigra or negra or negro means black or dark. So the reason it's called the substantia nigra is because it is pigmented with melanin, which gives it a blackish grayish color. The substantia nigra are nuclei that are interconnected with nuclei that are located in the cerebrum, and they help to maintain muscle tone and coordinate movement. So again, the red nuclei and the substantia nigra together looks like are going to be coordinating some of your motor movements, your muscle movements, and also the substantia nigra involved in maintaining muscle tone. Again, the nerve tracts, remember you do have a ascending and descending or sensory and motor nerve tracts in your midbrain. The sensory nerve tracts are called the tegmentum, and then the descending tracts are going to be going through those cerebral peduncles. And again, these are tracts that carry information from the cerebrum, which again is the superior, biggest part of your brain, through the brainstem down to the spinal cord. So again, just kind of helping to relay information from the cerebrum down to the spinal cord to get out to your body. Again, here are two of the four colliculi in that tectum. You can see the superior, again, the inferior will be below this, and we're looking at a superior view. Then here we have our tegmentum, which is going to be, again, the sensory nerve tracts, again, containing the red nuclei here. Again, remember those red nuclei are responsible for unconsciously coordinating and regulating motor activities. And then we have those cerebral peduncles, which are, again, the motor nerve tracts that are leading from the cerebrum through the brainstem down to the spinal cord. So these are the cerebral peduncles. And then here are our substantia nigra, which again have a similar function to the red nuclei. They are helping to coordinate your muscle movements in addition to maintain muscle tone. Okay, earlier we talked about the reticular formation extended throughout all parts of the brainstem. That would be the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Again, this reticular formation is a group of nuclei that are all the way through all three of those parts. And they play roles in arousal, awareness, posture, pain, and your sleep-wake cycle. They also help other nuclei, cranial nuclei in your brainstem, coordinate swallowing, breathing, and the heart rate. So again, some more of those very important life-sustaining processes. Okay, and that will be it for the brainstem. Moving on, and sorry, I yawned. Moving on to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is attached to the brainstem, and it's posterior to the brainstem, mainly posterior to that pons. It has a gray outer surface with white medulla inside. The cortex, or the outer surface, is folded into ridges that we call folia, and then the white matter, the white medulla inside, resembles a tree, and so it's called the arbor vitae, and we'll see that here in a few minutes. There are three major parts of our cerebellum: the flocculonodular lobe, try to say that 5 times really fast. The vermis, and then the lateral hemispheres. The flocculonodular lobe is involved in balance and eye movement. The vermis is involved in posture, locomotion, and fine motor coordination. And the lateral hemispheres are involved in planning, practicing, and learning complex movements. The lateral hemispheres, there are 2 of those, and they are separated by the primary fissure into an anterior and posterior lobe. So each lateral hemisphere contains an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe, and we'll see those in a few minutes. Again, as you can see here, looking at the cerebellum, it is involved with movement. It is involved with balance and eye movement. It is involved in locomotion, posture, and fine motor coordination. It is involved in learning complex movement. So overall, our cerebellum is involved in our voluntary muscular movement and helping us to maintain our balance, our posture, to control not only the fine movement, but also learn more complex movements as well. And my cerebellum must not be really highly developed because I'm not really good with movement. I've never been able to do gymnastics. I can't even do a cartwheel. I can't do any of that. I'm not, I could never have been a cheerleader or being like in the band and being one of those waving the flag or anything like that because I just don't have really good coordination and things like that. So I would say my cerebellum isn't as highly developed as some people's cerebellum probably is. Okay, in our cerebellum, we also have the Purkinje cells. These are the largest cells in the central nervous system. They have over 200,000 synapses. Okay, so a Purkinje cell. One Purkinje cell can have over 200,000 synapses. That means connections. Over 200,000 connections with other cells. And they are inhibitory. So Purkinje cells are inhibitory, specifically. The cerebellum also communicates with other regions in our central nervous system through 3 large cerebellar pedicles. Now, don't get this confused with the cerebral pedicles. Okay, we have cerebral pedicles here in our midbrain, okay, that are relaying information from our cerebrum through our brainstem to our spinal cord, okay? So that's not what we're talking about here. These are cerebellar pedicles. And again, these are going to contain nerve tracts that are going to allow the cerebellum to communicate with other parts in our CNS. So, cerebrum, brainstem, spinal cord. And these nerve tracts are the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar pedicles. And again, overall, the cerebellar functions include controlling muscle movement and tone, helping with your balance, regulating intentional movements, and learning new motor skills. So again, this is, you guys, whenever someone drinks and they drink too much and they get tipsy and they can't walk the straight line and they can't maintain their balance, that is because alcohol affects their cerebellum. And that's what the cerebellum does. It helps you maintain your balance. It helps to control your movement. It helps you to learn new motor skills. And so if you take something that affects the cerebellum, then it's going to affect your muscle movements. Okay, again, here is our cerebellum, again, posterior to the brainstem specifically. It's behind the pons here of the brainstem. We see this is a hemisphere. Here we see the lateral hemispheres, and they are separated into an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. Again, here's the anterior lobe. It is more superior and anterior. The posterior lobe is more posterior and inferior, I guess you could say. We can see here the flocculonodular lobe. We can see the fovea here are the folds. We can see the vermis here. You can also see the vermis here in this picture. You can also see the arbor vitae. Again, you can see how that white matter, this is gray matter. See how it's kind of darker, but you have some white matter here that looks kind of like the branches of a tree. So that's the arbor vitae, arbor for tree. And again, the fovea are the folds. Here you can see the vermis. You can see the vermis better from this inferior view. Again, looking from the bottom of it. Okay, now, last today we're going to look at the diencephalon. The diencephalon, again, is that portion of the brain that's really in the center of the brain. It is between the brainstem and the cerebrum, so the brainstem kind of protrudes inferiorly. The cerebrum is more superior, and so the diencephalon is between those two. And again, it is composed of the thalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. The thalamus and the hypothalamus are going to be the two that we'll focus on the most, but we will talk about the subthalamus and the epithalamus as well. Again, the thalamus is the largest part of the diencephalon. We'll see that in a minute. It is the two portions. It has two lateral portions, so again on the sides, connected by an intrathalamic adhesion there in the center connecting the two. Sensory information from your spinal cord will synapse. It will be carried here before projecting to the appropriate portions of the cerebrum. So again, we say the thalamus is the relay station for all sensory information except for smell. Your olfactory neurons, which are your sensory neurons involved in smell, do not synapse. They do not go through the thalamus. So the thalamus is the relay station for all sensory information except for smell. So anything you hear, anything you see, anything that you feel or that you taste is going to go through the thalamus. And then the thalamus will direct it to the correct part of the cerebrum, because in the cerebrum is where most of those things will be interpreted. It's where your brain will make sense of them and decide the appropriate response. So they will be integrated or processed in the cerebrum, but they're processed in different parts of the cerebrum. So it is the thalamus that receives those stimuli and then directs them to the appropriate part of the cerebrum where they should go. Again, so we say that the sensory information from 4 of our 5 senses synapses. It runs through the thalamus and then it is directed or projected to the appropriate part of the cerebrum. Again, our thalamus is also helpful in helping us to filter out some of that sensory information that's coming through that may not be important to us at the time. Let's say for right now, let's say you are sitting in your room listening to this video. Okay, so the important information is what you're seeing on the screen and what you're hearing. But maybe you may also, there may be sounds coming from your heat kicking off or on. You may be feeling hungry. You may have a little itch on your foot or a little pain in your ear. You have lots of different sensory stimuli coming in from your environment. It is your thalamus that also helps you to pay attention to the things that are important and to filter out things that aren't important. So maybe that little hunger pain you're feeling right now, you're not really paying attention to because you're worried about listening to this video and getting this work done. Maybe those sounds from your heat kicking off or on, you're not really paying attention to. It is your thalamus that's helping you do that. So your thalamus, all the sensory information is routed into the thalamus except for smell, and then the thalamus sends the appropriate stimuli to the appropriate places of the cerebrum, and then it just kind of filters out the things that aren't important to you at that moment. So specifically, there are many different nuclei in the thalamus that are helping you do this. The medial geniculate nucleus is going to be receiving and projecting the auditory information out to the cerebrum, specifically to the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. The lateral geniculate nucleus is going to be receiving the visual information and projecting it out to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. The ventral posterior nucleus is going to be receiving the other sensory information. So that is going to be your tactile and your taste, and sending it out to the appropriate place, the appropriate center in the cerebrum, in this case probably the parietal lobes. So in addition to being a relay station for all the sensory information except for smell, the thalamus also helps to influence mood and actions associated with strong emotions. So it also helps to, when you have strong emotions, it helps to influence your mood as well as the actions that you take in response to those emotions. So the ventral anterior and ventral lateral nuclei are going to help determine the action, the motor function associated with strong emotions. The anterior probably are connected to the limbic system, which we'll talk about more later, probably after spring break, because next Monday is spring break, so we won't be talking about them next Monday. It'll be after spring break. So anyway, the anterior medial nuclei are connected to the limbic system, and it helps to regulate or influence your moods associated with these emotions. The lateral dorsal nucleus of the thalamus is involved in regulating those emotions, those strong emotions. And then the lateral posterior and pulvinar nuclei in the thalamus are involved in sensory integration. So again, in addition to the nuclei that are receiving the sensory information and projecting it out to the appropriate portion of the cerebrum, you also have the lateral, posterior, and pulvinar nuclei. And again, remember, these nuclei are just clusters of neurons. So when you look at the thalamus, you're not going to see all these different nuclei. Now, we do have a picture that we'll be looking at that will kind of have those different areas kind of, rounded off and in different colors to kind of help us to visualize these nuclei. But again, these nuclei are not distinct structures in this thalamus that you can see. You can kind of see the thalamus, but you can't see these distinct nuclei in the thalamus because they're just clusters of neurons in the thalamus that are kind of doing the same thing. Okay, obviously inferior to the thalamus is the subthalamus. Sub means below, so below or inferior to the thalamus, you're going to find the subthalamus. And it functions as part of the subcortical basal nuclei in helping to control motor function. It also contains the subthalamic nuclei, and these subthalamic nuclei are in the subthalamus along with ascending and descending nerve tracts. So again, both sensory and motor nerve tracts are going to be going through this thalamus or this subthalamus. The epithalamus, epi means outer or outside, so it is going to be above, so kind of superior to as well as a little bit posterior to the thalamus. It contains two parts that you do need to be familiar with. The habenula is involved in behavior associated with rewards. So it is involved in addictive behaviors. So you have motivation to do something because of a reward that you get from doing that something. Okay, the habenula is involved in that. Like children, we give them an allowance to clean their room. Okay, so we give them a reward for cleaning their room. And so they continue to clean their room because they get that reward. So the association of the reward and the behavior. You do the behavior, you get the reward, and the motivation that comes with that comes from this habenula. And you guys, and that's what's involved in an addiction. People oftentimes get addicted because they are feeling bad. They feel poorly, or maybe they don't feel bad, but they just don't feel good. They just feel normal. And then they try a certain drug or they try a certain behavior. It doesn't have to be a drug. It could be gambling. It could be playing the lottery. It could be sex. And the reward that they get is a lot of times is a good feeling. Drugs make you have this high, this euphoric feeling. Sex, have this good feeling, this euphoric feeling. Gambling, you get a good feeling from doing that. So that is a reward. So when you do this behavior, you get that good feeling, you get that reward, and that's what leads to addictions. And again, that is all centered here in this habenula of the epithalamus. The other part of the epithalamus is the pineal gland, very important. It helps to modulate sleep-wake cycles and other biorhythms like your fertility cycles, like your menstrual cycle and things, is going to be modulated at least in part here in the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is working in addition to other parts of our brain. I think we talked about, where was it earlier? We talked about the reticular formation. The nuclei are involved in the sleep-wake cycle. Well, in addition to the reticular formation in the brainstem, those nuclei, we also have the pineal gland in the epithalamus helping to be involved and modulate that sleep-wake cycle, as well as other biorhythms like fertility. That would be another example of a biorhythm that you would be familiar with as far as humans go. Okay, the other big part of the diencephalon that I want you to be familiar with is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, again, hypo means below or under. So the hypothalamus is going to be the inferior portion of the diencephalon. It contains the mammillary bodies, which are involved in olfactory reflexes. Again, that is odor, that is smell. Olfactory is referring to smell. So reflexes involved with smell as well as emotional responses to smell. So again, this is kind of going to go back to, you have, when I smell of Scotch tape and I have a good feeling, a warm, fuzzy feeling because it reminds me of Christmas. That nostalgic feeling that you have when you smell Scotch tape, or when you smell a certain odor and it makes you think of something, and the feelings that you have associated with that. So emotional feelings, emotional responses related to odors are going to be centered here in the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus. Also, we have the infundibulum. The infundibulum is actually a stalk that extends from the floor of the hypothalamus and connects the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland. What we see, you guys, is the hypothalamus is the major connection between the brain and the endocrine system. You guys, our brain controls the release of the hormones that our endocrine system produces and secretes. And how the brain does that? Well, the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that does that. So the hypothalamus connects to the pituitary gland, which by the infundibulum, and in this way, it controls the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus regulates the secretions of the pituitary gland. It regulates the secretion of hormones of the pituitary gland, and it's the hormones that are being released by the pituitary gland, specifically the posterior pituitary gland, is what the hypothalamus is controlling. These hormones influence your metabolism, your reproductive cycles, your hormones being released when you're under stress, even ADH, which is a hormone that controls your urine production in your kidneys. So basically, you have endocrine glands on top of your kidneys called the adrenal glands, and that ADH goes to those adrenal glands, and it also goes to the kidneys themselves, and it helps to regulate the production of the urine by the kidneys. And you'll learn a lot more about the endocrine system and its connection to the brain, to the hypothalamus, as well as the pituitary gland and all the other glands of the endocrine system and the hormones they secrete when you take the second anatomy class, Anatomy 2. Also, your hypothalamus receives input from your viscera, your internal organs, as well as your tongue, your taste receptors in your tongue, your limbic system, which we'll talk more about after spring break, and your external genitalia. It receives input from a lot of different places. Overall, the major function of the hypothalamus is helping to maintain homeostasis, not only through regulating the secretion of hormones by the pituitary gland. Some of those help to maintain homeostasis by influencing metabolism and things like that, but also by regulating your heart and digestive activities. In addition, again, those autonomic things that we don't have any control over, helping us to maintain homeostasis. In addition, it's helping to control swallowing, shivering, and sweating. Overall, the hypothalamus is important in regulating mood and emotion, sexual pleasure, thirst and hunger, your biological clock, again, sleep-wake cycle, rage and fear. So again, the hypothalamus is involved with a lot of those autonomic functions and helping to maintain homeostasis in your body, both through controlling that posterior pituitary and regulating the release of hormones by the pituitary gland and other endocrine glands in your body, and through regulating your heart rate and digestive activities. Okay, so here's our diencephalon. You can see here is our thalamus, the largest portion of the diencephalon. Here is that interthalamic adhesion that connects the two lateral portions of the thalamus. Then we can see the hypothalamus here in all these different colors, showing some of the different nuclei in the hypothalamus. Here you can see the infundibulum, and here's the pituitary gland. Again, that infundibulum is a stalk connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary. The hypothalamus controls the release of hormones by the pituitary, and then a lot of those hormones that are released by the pituitary will go to other endocrine glands and stimulate them to release their own hormones. Then we also have, and again, here's that pituitary gland, here's that infundibulum, there's the hypothalamus. Here we have the subthalamus below the thalamus, and then here we have the habenula and the pineal gland, which are called the epithalamus. Again, not really too much superior, but more posterior, looks to me, behind the thalamus. So all this area is the thalamus, the relay station for all the sensory information. Again, we can see here is a picture an enlarged picture focusing in just on the thalamus. Here we see the two portions. Here's that interthalamic adhesion. Medial nucleus is there where that interthalamic adhesion is. But you can see all the different nuclei that we talked about. The lateral geniculate, the ventral lateral, the ventral posterior, and all that good stuff. And then here you can see several nuclei that are found within your hypothalamus as well. Okay, and that is all we're going to talk about today. We will be talking about the rest of the brain and the cranial nerves after spring break. Again, tomorrow and Friday will be lab days. You're actually going to be looking, I think it's the spinal cord and spinal nerves, and then the brain and cranial nerves both. So on Thursday, I think it's spinal cord, and Friday brain, or maybe Thursday brain and Friday spinal cord. Anyway, you're going to be looking at the spinal cord, spinal nerves, brain, and cranial nerves on Thursday and Friday. So don't forget to print out those lab handouts and complete them. Be able to answer I'll also be sure you ask the questions on our next lab exam. You will have diagrams, as well as I will be asking you questions to answer again about and those questions and those diagrams will come from the diagrams and the questions that you're answering in these lab handouts. So if you are not looking at the lab handouts, if you are not completing them, if you are not answering the questions, then you are really putting yourself at a disadvantage when it comes time for the exam and even for the quiz, because the quizzes also come from these things. So please let me know if you have any questions. Email me. You can, if you want to talk to me, you can email me your number and I will call you, text you, Skype you, FaceTime you, whatever. Otherwise, hope you do well the next couple days. Get those labs done, and then enjoy your spring break next week. We'll talk to you later. Bye bye.